If you remember last week, we kind of gave an introduction to what these images are and how they can be interpreted. These images that we'll be studying are what we would call metaphors, where the Lord is being compared to a particular object or something that has some kind of a comparable characteristic with the Lord. So we looked at last week the idea of metaphors being as and a simile. A simile is like A is like B. A metaphor basically describes the same thing, but more like without using the word like. It's like A is B. So now in the Hebrew Old Testament, there's 4 words that can be translated rock, and the first word is the word, I'll just pronounce it for you, it's the word Evan, and it's almost exclusively translated in our Bibles by the word stone. And so here's all these examples. If you look up the word stone, we can see that the word behind it is this word Evan or stone. A number of years ago, when I was younger, the nation of Israel had an ambassador of the United Nations. His name was Abba Eben, and his name was composed of 2 Hebrew words or Aramaic words, Abba, the word for father, and Evan or Eben, the word for stone. So that's our word here. Evan, it refers to a stone. The stone could be basically the distinction between other words for rock and this word is this word always refers to a rock which is movable. It may be a large rock, or it might be the building stone of a city wall, but in all those cases, it's still referred to as a stone because it was movable. So, there's 200 or 300 times in Old and New Testament where we have references to the word stone. This word is never used as an image for the Lord. Another word that's only used twice in the Old Testament that is translated either as rocks or cliff, and it's a word pronounced kaf. Aramaic, it would be kapha. The reason I'm pronouncing it for you is if you go to John 1, I think it's verse 42, we see this word used in the New Testament as it's applied by Jesus to Simon Peter. So Andrew brought Peter to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You will be called Cephas," which is translated Petros. And so what's happening here is Peter actually ends up with 3 names. He's Simon, the son of John. Jesus says you'll call him Cephas, which is this Aramaic term found for rock or rocks in the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament. And it's an Aramaic word that means rock. And then John retranslates it for us out of Aramaic into Greek. And so Simon, the son of John, given the Aramaic name Cephas for rock, retranslated into Greek as Petros for rock. Again, this word is never used as an attribute of God or as an image of God in the Old Testament. There are 2 other words. I don't need to pronounce them for you, but there's 2 other words that are used as synonyms of one another that are the primary words used in the Old Testament in describing the Lord as a rock. And these words have the meaning of what distinguishes them from a stone is that these 2 words can be translated as a mountain, a cliff, a high precipice, the side of a mountain. The difference between these 2 words that are used with relationship to the Lord and the word for stone, for instance, is that word Evan. That is something that's movable. The words that are used as images for the Lord are not movable. They are part of what you might say, the ground formation. They can refer to a large boulder, something that might look like haystack rock, which, even though I don't know that you would call that a mountain or even a hill, it's just like a boulder that sticks up there out of the sea, and yet it's not movable. And so that could be a possibility, but most of the time it's referring to either a cliff on the side of a mountain or sometimes a mountain itself. And so these two words that are used synonymously are the words that are predominantly used in the Old Testament, and particularly in the book of Psalms, for the images of God that we'll be studying. The rock is used as an image of God in the Old Testament about, I counted 38 times. 21 times it's used in the book of Psalms. Now, again, just to remind you what we're talking about here, if we go to Psalm 18:2, well, here, I'm going to do it differently. Let's just look up references to the phrase my rock. And here we go. The Lord is my rock. That's one of our words. That's the second word. They're both synonym. They're both translated the same. But look at these references here in 2 Samuel. This is David speaking. The Lord lives, and blessed be my rock. Psalm 18:2, the Lord is my rock. Psalm 18:46, blessed be my rock. O Lord, my rock and my redeemer, my rock, do not be deaf to me. So what we have here are examples where the Lord is being described by this psalmist here and by David as not simply a rock or the rock. He's my rock. And you have these personal pronouns introducing the phrase here. So when we study the literal, what we might call the literal background to rocks in the Old Testament, or the rock, I'm going to show you two primary usages. Now remember, we're looking for the literal idea of a rock and the characteristic of a literal rock that could be applied to the Lord in a figurative way. So there's certain attributes of a rock that illustrate or reflect the attribute, that same attribute in the Lord. I hope I got that right, what I described there. But let's look at an example in Exodus 17. This is where the Lord brings water out of the rock at Mount Horeb. And the Lord says, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it. So this, of course, happened in Exodus 17, and then we're also going to see it happen in Numbers chapter 20, where, again, water is brought forth out of the rock, but this time, as opposed to striking the rock, the Lord asks Moses to speak to the rock, and Moses does not obey the Lord. He instead strikes the rock, and so the Lord disciplines him for that. But here's one of the examples of a literal rock in the Old Testament that played a very important role in the history of the sons of Israel, and in a lot of the poetic literature of the Old Testament. There will be a number of examples where they refer back to this event where the Lord brought water out of a rock. By far, the most prevalent use of the word rock or rocks in the Old Testament are for providing a place of escape for refugees, a place to which people who are being chased by enemies can flee and hide themselves. So when we look at the rock in the Old Testament and we see the number of times it's used in a literal sense, the vast majority of those times it's going to refer to a place of protection or a place of security. We'll look at some examples here. Isaiah chapter 2 has, let me see, verse 2, verse 19, and verse 21. So here's some illustrations of what we're talking about. Enter the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the splendor of splendor of his majesty. So here you can see a rock is a place where a person can hide. Of course, if you're hiding from the terror of the Lord, you're not going to be able to escape that. But anyway, 2:19, men go into the caves of the rocks. If you've ever seen pictures of the Qumran caves, the caves that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in, you see there are caves that are up high in the sides of a rock wall, kind of. And these caves in the rocks became places where men would hide themselves. And in verse 21, fleeing to go into the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the cliffs. These are our two words used for rocks in this sense, and they're different words, but they're synonyms, and so we see them translated here, rocks and the parallel cliffs. So another example would be in Jeremiah 16:16. I don't have to give all of these to you. Behold, I'm going to send for many fishermen, declares the Lord. They will fish for them, and afterwards I will send for many hunters. They will hunt them from every mountain and every hill and from the clefts of the rocks. So again, the Lord is going to ascend the Babylonians, and they're going to conquer the Israelites, and they're going to hunt them down, and they're going to root them out of every mountain, every hill, and from the clefts of the rock. So from every mountain, hill, and clefts of the rocks. And so we have these things parallel here. The rocks were a place where people would run for refuge or to escape enemies. And even, I think there's one even in the animal world, Psalm 104:18. The high mountains are for the wild goats. The cliffs, this is one of our words for rock here, are a refuge, so the connection there, for the Shephanim, which is a kind of this is simply a Hebrew word that's been transliterated, the sound, into English letters. But according to most commentaries, they're not really sure what this is, but other translations will translate this as a rock badger. And why would a rock badger be in the cliffs? Well, because it's a refuge, just as the high mountains are a refuge for wild goats. So the connection between rocks and places of refuge is pretty prominent in the Old Testament. And of course, that kind of introduces us to the use of these images with regard to the Lord. Now, there are a couple other examples that actually come from the time of David. And these are important because since David is the one that uses this image so often, we want to see what the rocks, the image of the rock, would imply for him, why he would use that as a reference to the Lord. And so I have a couple examples here. 1 Samuel 13:60. So we're in 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel is, that's not the right verse. 1 Samuel 13:60, it should be 13:6. So the book of 1 Samuel is primarily about the reign of King Saul, and it also introduces David before he became king. And in 1 Samuel 13:6, the enemies of Israel in the book of 1 Samuel under the reign of King Saul were primarily the Philistines. And in this chapter, the Philistines are chasing down the men of Israel. And the men of Israel, it says at the end of this verse, they hide themselves in caves, in thickets, in cliffs. That's our word for rock right there, cellars and pits. So these are hiding places, places to escape enemies. And here we have our word for rock right there. Now, David himself had his own experience of escaping from Saul himself. And in 1 Samuel 25, in 1 Samuel 23, so David has his own. David himself was being chased by Saul and his men, and he and his men escaped Saul by going down to the rock, as it says here. Notice, they told David, and he came down to the rock. Now, it doesn't say what rock we're talking about, but apparently there was a particular rock formation that provided a place of escape for David and his men in the wilderness of Maon. And so we read, and when Saul heard it, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David went and his men on the other side of the mountain. The connection here, notice, this is the normal Hebrew word for mountain, but notice the rock is where David was staying, and the mountain is where he was pursued. So we actually have a connection here. This is not simply a rock. We're talking about something like a mountain. Saul's on one side, David and his men is on the other, and David escapes when Saul has to leave because the Philistines were making a raid on the land. But notice what happens. So Saul returned from pursuing David and went to meet the Philistines. Therefore, they call that place the Rock of Escape. So this rock, or this mountain where David escaped King Saul, was renamed here as the Rock of Escape. And from there it says David went up and stayed in the strongholds of En-gedi. En-gedi is just above the Dead Sea there. Again, another stronghold or hiding place for King David. So again, in David's experience, when he makes reference to the rock, as we see here in this passage, the rock, he sees the rock as a place of protection, a place of escape, a place where he can hide from his enemies and be protected. So that's the literal use of the rock in the context of David's own his own life as he was pursued by his enemies. Is going to be what's behind the use of the rock imagery in the book of Psalms that David applies to the Lord. The rock is used in other parts of the Old Testament, and different aspects of the rock are used in some of these different examples. Psalm chapter 40 speaks of how the Lord will lift our feet up on the rock and make our steps firm. So in that particular psalm, we have the rock being used as an image of firmness. The firmness of a rock is what's the point of connection here. Okay, in this verse, it's rocks are firm, and the Lord is making my footsteps firm, just like placing my feet upon the rock. So that's the firmness of a rock. The stubbornness of the nation of Israel as they refuse to listen to the voice of the prophets is compared to the hardness of a rock. They have made their faces harder than rock. And so here the hardness of a rock is the point of comparison with the faces of these stubborn Israelites. They have refused to repent. And so the imagery of a rock, the point of comparison is different in different verses, but when David speaks of the Lord as a rock, he is especially referring to the refuge that the Lord provides for him. The imagery of a rock is used outside of the book of Psalms, and what I want to just show you is it's prevalent throughout all periods of history in the Old Testament. The image of the Lord as a rock did not begin with King David or with the book of Psalms. And I'll show you some examples of that just as again, the rock did not begin, the imagery of the rock as an image for the Lord did not begin with David. We actually see Moses using it in Deuteronomy 32, where just before he's taken up on the hill and allowed to see the promised land, and then his life will end. We see this song that he sings in Deuteronomy 32. And I think 5 times here he makes reference to the Lord as a rock. Deuteronomy 32:4, the rock, his way is perfect. He forsook the God who made him. He scorned the rock of his salvation. The God who made him, the rock of his salvation. You neglected the rock who begot you. You forgot the God who gave you birth. See the parallels here in Hebrew poetry? Rock here, God here, God here, rock here. The rock here, a God of faithfulness here. This Hebrew poetry likes to use these parallels. It's one of the characteristics of it. Unless their rock had sold them, and the Lord had given them up. So this is Moses speaking, and in this verse he actually compares the gods of the Canaanites to rocks as well. He says, "Indeed, their rock is not like our rock. Even our enemies themselves judge this. Their rock would be referred to the gods of the enemies. Our rock would be refer to the God of Israel." To go from Moses in the book of Deuteronomy all the way to the time of the Babylonian exile and the prophet Habakkuk in 1:12, he too refers to the Lord as a rock. "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We will not die. You, O Lord, have appointed them to judge." This is referring to the Babylonians. "And you, O rock, have established them to correct. So the parallel, O Lord, O rock. The Lord here is simply described even in Habakkuk. Let's see, we're Moses 1500, Habakkuk 600. So we're maybe 900 years apart here, and we see this imagery of the Lord as a rock throughout all of the Old Testament. Now, when we go to the book of Psalms and look at the actual Psalms where the rock is used as a metaphor for the Lord, I think you'll be able to see very clearly the connection between the rock as a place of refuge and the Lord as a refuge for the psalmist. So let's begin. The first word that we're going to look at that's used is that the word for rock is pronounced Selah, if I haven't mentioned that already. Selah is not the same word as we find at the end of some of the Psalms as a musical notation. They sound the same, but the meaning or the spelling is different, so they're not the same word. So Psalm 18:2. So Psalm 18:2 is where we're going to start, and I got to change that to a period. The Lord is my... Now notice the words that are used in conjunction with this word here, rock. The Lord is my rock, fortress, deliverer. Here's our second word for rock. My rock in whom I take refuge. My shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. We're going to look at some of these other words here. Stronghold, fortress, shield. And they all have a common element to them. They all provide protection. And when David says the Lord is my rock, it's another way of saying the Lord is my protector. Here down in 31:3, you are my rock and my fortress. Okay, a fortress, a place, well, you know what a fort is. Why was a fort built? A fort was built to provide protection against enemies. Here in Psalm 42:9, the Lord is addressed by this phrase, my rock. I will say to God, my rock. And here the psalmist is crying out for the Lord to answer him. He's mourning because he's being oppressed by enemies. He's not being relieved yet by the Lord. He hasn't been delivered yet by the Lord. And so he's crying out to his rock as the one who would deliver him. Here in Psalm 71:3, be to me a rock of habitation. Habitation is a kind of a, I'll show you what other translations say here. Let's see, Psalm 71:3. Be to me a rock of habitation. The English Standard Version simply says, be to me a rock of refuge, to which I may continually come. The New English Translation, be my protector and refuge. The NIV, be my rock of refuge, to which I can always go. So the New American Standard here, be a rock of habitation. The idea behind it, as we see in other translations, is, again, this is a place of refuge. And a rock of habitation here, and you are my rock. Both these words, different words but synonyms, both indicate the Lord as a place whereby the psalmist can run and be protected. Another example of the rock being used as a place of hiding or concealment. In the day of trouble, he will conceal me in his tabernacle. In the secret place of his tent, he will hide me. He will lift me up upon a rock. So we've got being hidden, being concealed, being lifted up upon a rock. That's the intent of it. Psalm 31:2, be to me a rock of strength, a stronghold to save me, for you are my rock and my fortress. Let's see. Here's one here, Psalm 61:2. From the end of the earth I call to you when my heart is faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. And again, here we're looking at a rock where the psalmist can be lifted up and out of reach of his enemies, if you will. Rock, salvation, stronghold. So again, as you go through Psalm 62:7, the rock of my strength, my refuge, we see the correlation between rock and refuge. And here we have God was their rock, the Most High their Redeemer. Got rock and redemption there. But again, most of the references to the Lord as a rock are with relationship to being a place of refuge. So in the book of Psalms, the imagery of the rock, when the Lord is compared to a rock by King David especially, but by other psalmists as well, we have most of those references are going to be in relationship to the Lord as a place of refuge, a place of protection. So a fortress, refuge again. So when we look at this imagery of the rock and it's applied to the Lord in the book of Psalms, the Lord is being described and declared to be a protector, a refuge, one to whom you can run for protection, one to whom you can run to find refuge, one to whom you can run and be concealed from your enemies. That's who the Lord was to David. He experienced it in his own life when he had to run to the rocks to hide from King Saul, and the Israelites ran to the rocks to hide from their enemies. Now David says, the Lord, you are my rock. You are my protector. You're the one that I can count on to protect me. So in this time of a lot of fear and anxiety over this virus that's going around, let's remember we have a protector. We have one to whom we can run to for help and run to and just find rest in his refuge. And that, of course, is the Lord. I do want to show you one verse in the New Testament that's, let's see, let me show you a verse in the New Testament that uses the rock imagery that we see in the book of Psalms. It's in 1 Corinthians 10:4, and just to get a little context, we'll start with verse 3. This is referring back to Israel in the wilderness. says they all ate the same spiritual food, they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. So here we have another metaphor with relationship to the rock and Christ. Christ was the rock. So the rock that followed them in the wilderness, that literal rock from which water flowed, Paul makes a spiritual application to that, as Christ was the one who provides that. He's the spiritual rock who provides the spiritual drink, the spiritual water that gives us spiritual life. The rock was Christ. So Christ is our protector. Christ is the one to whom we can go to when we need provision. He will provide for us and he will protect us. And it's all seen in the imagery of the rock. The rock provides the foundation for that great hymn, Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. And that hymn is actually reflecting that metaphorical meaning of the word rock with relationship to the Lord. Hope you enjoyed the study. It was a lot of verses to look up, but they all are pointing to the Lord as our protector and as our rock. Blessed be the rock of our salvation.